Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate,
a podcast by the Institute for Replication,
where we put research to the test again.
In this episode, we'll have Misha Teplitskiy telling us if novel research is worth doing. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Juan Pablo. I'm here with our co-host, Abel, and we have an incredible special guest today, Professor Misha Teplitskiy. He's from the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Misha, welcome to the podcast. It's amazing to have you. Why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll tell people what we're here discussing today.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's an honor, and I'm an assistant professor at School of Information. I study broadly how institutions influence scientific research. And when I say institutions, I mean things like policy at various levels, and also organizational kind of practices and organizational design. So that's sort of broadly what I'm interested in. I'm also really interested in how ideas diffuse, and this could be across individuals, again, organizations, how all of that is affected by technology and in society, like remote work, and so on. So those are kind of my two big topics.
That's super interesting. Misha, the reason we wanted to talk to you in the first place is this you have two amazing papers. Well, all of your research is really great. Like I don't want to downplay them all, but you have two papers that are...
I'll be sure to forward that to my dean. Can I clip that sound file? I'll send it right over then.
Please do. But we were very interested in two papers, and I think let's just start with the first one because it has an amazing title. Is novel research worth doing? And I think the first time you hear this title, it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder, what is it all about? What do you consider to be noble? And why do you think the question is pertinent? Why do you think we should be asking this kind of stuff? Can you give us a glimpse into what the paper explores, what it finds, and what is the main idea behind all this?
Yeah, so the title was, designed to be a bit provocative, but before I started the project, we actually thought the answer was sort of obvious, and the answer is essentially no. And this comes, right, which is kind of sad, maybe sad to hear, but for people working, for scientists, but also kind of meta-scientists like ourselves, long literature basically arguing, maybe we can even say showing that scientific institutions select for conservative work. So, there's like innumerable anecdotes along these lines. Lots of kind of most innovative ideas have been rejected. You can find theory for this, like, why, the aphorism is something, extraordinary ideas require extraordinary evidence, right? This is kind of one of line of thinking. And then there's lots of stories you can come up with for why that's true on a psychological level, on kind of strategic level, and so on and so on. And what was kind of striking when I dove into this literature was how indirect all of this evidence really was. So we were working with this kind of project started as we were working with a publishing company. We were interested in a variety of questions, not only this one. Broadly, we wanted to help them design a better kind of selection system, the selection process. That's sort of like the big picture goal. So this was one big aspect of the selection process. And so as we dove into this literature, we had the same prior everybody else had, pretty much. But when you would go to find a reference for this claim that scientific institutions are conservative, it was shockingly hard to actually find the very credible or kind of direct evidence. Like all of it was sort of a lab study with a measure of novelty that was kind of odd, or the task didn't seem quite right. Or it was looking at, for example, a lot of the scientometrics kind of literature was looking at things that have already been selected, and then you kind of look at how well they, the kind of impact they achieve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of, and even looking at the psych literature, it was also kind of I don't want to say disappointing, but I had really trouble finding. I was like, well, everybody knows this, but like, why can't I find like 5 solid references? And so we thought, we were sitting on an empirical kind of setup. Like we had data on manuscripts getting submitted to these companies, their selections. So like our kind of, it's been a while, but I think our original plan was like, well, of course we're going to replicate that more novel things get selected against, and then we'll try to figure out why that happens or something. And so the nuts and bolts of this project were basically using these peer review files from these companies. We were measuring, so we kind of, need that ingredient, and then we need some kind of measure of novelty. That's a huge can of worms, and so we relied on a measure that was, in our sense, used the most and kind of the most credible. Though, in retrospect, it's like, I've now come to the conclusion that we don't have any super credible measures. This might be the best of the bunch, but like even there, I'm sort of not 100%. I don't think it's 100% certain. But anyway, so we put those two ingredients together. We had this novelty measure of the files, and we basically were surprised to see more novel manuscripts. And in our case, we're measuring them using the references, kind of unusual combinations of references, seeing them selected for, and then, okay, is that a fluke or what's going on? So maybe we need to control for this or that. So we start playing around with exploring the sort of all the parameters that we have, the pattern of more novel things getting selected didn't go away no matter kind of what we tried. And maybe the most sort of reasonable or kind of stringent thing we did was to say, okay, it's not clear how novelty and quality are, correlated or anti-correlated. So let's try to measure them kind of together to the extent that we can. And so we looked at, papers that did not get desk rejected, so they got some peer reviews. And then we would say like, okay, given the same set of peer reviews, some are more novel, some are less novel according to our measure. What happens, what does the editor do at the kind of the last stage? And that's where we, if I remember correctly, actually saw the biggest kind of difference, that like controlling for, quality, quote unquote, in terms of peer review recommendations, still the novel work got selected for by a big margin. And so, to sum up, it was kind of, the paper was basically conducting a relatively straightforward test of what, in our sense, was very well established, and finding that, wait, maybe it's not nearly as well established as we thought. And
Yeah, let me jump in, Misha, if I can. There's a lot of great observations and things you've mentioned. I think I've worked on a similar project where we managed to get rejected manuscripts, and we were in a similar situation as yours. I just didn't know what to cite. And that's the moment I realized, okay, actually, it's insanely hard to get data on rejected manuscripts or rejected, whatever, papers or funding applications. And so when you end up in this specific case, you don't really know actually which papers to cite because the data is quite unique. And this is when you realize that actually lots of people have been trying to answer these questions, but they cannot. And I remember we were also trying to control for quality. We're trying to control for different things and looking at the role of the editors versus the referees. And so it's really interesting what you're describing, because I went through the same thing on a different project.
Yeah.
But one thing, I guess, going back to the beginning of the conversation, a lot of people who are not in academia would be surprised. They would just think like, well, of course, novel results should get published more. It's novel. Like, what are we doing trying not to publish things that are novel? And I think, when you talk to people in the open science community, as you've mentioned, there seems to be this way of thinking of, well, no, actually, when get anecdotal evidence here and there, like, oh, these people like won a Nobel Prize in physics, but got rejected many times. And this happens, and everybody has stories of being rejected. And I think, to me at least, this is where you realize that it doesn't matter if your research is novel or not, you're going to get rejected like a lot. And you sort of, you hear these stories of these amazing papers that get rejected. It's like, well, they all got rejected. The amazing ones or not. And so that's why I find it interesting that you're able to move beyond just the anecdotal evidence. But I guess, you can react to this if you will. But one question would be, how do you differentiate between the quality versus the novelty? And do you think we're able to do this empirically? How confident you are in being able to do that?
Yeah. Well, so let me hit a few points. So on the earlier point, one thing I think is interesting about the meta science space is so on the one hand, I agree that getting data, this kind of administrative data, is really hard and valuable. And on the other hand, to kind of be, I guess, put my kind of humble humility hat on, the longer you dig, and you're probably seeing this too, it actually is kind of disappointingly, in some sense, not that rare. Like after you invest all this time to get in this data, you kind of discover, oh, actually, there have been hundreds of studies along these lines, right? And I'm kind of not exaggerating with hundreds, because basically one thing, you find is like, these are pretty fundamental questions for the scientific enterprise, and so basically any editor or program manager, etc., has had these same questions for now 100 or 80 or whatever years, and a lot of them have had the data in hand, and so they've analyzed it, right? The quality analysis maybe varies, whatever. Like in practice, there's been like dozens and dozens and dozens, like literally hundreds of studies along these lines. I initially, going into the space, thought that the biggest bottleneck was the data. I think I've come away thinking that really the biggest bottleneck is kind of measurement or research design, right? Like it's kind of getting data is super hard, yeah, but even once you get it, it turns out to say anything meaningful is actually super hard, right? Okay, so that's kind of one point. Another point is, I in terms of is this surprising to the lay public, etc. Like I guess I would be curious about that empirically, because I'm not sure to me at least, it's not so obvious, because I think lots of people, probably in any organization, have had the experience of seeing the best idea not win, right? Or get rejected for the status quo, right? I suspect, right? So people kind of understand that there's conflicts of interest, there's sort of some kind of preference for status quo. People don't want to rock the boat, yada yada, right? So I don't know. Like I suspect this kind of narrative of science working also being conservative feels to them like an also rather than like super. I might be wrong, but anyway, that's kind of minor point. But on this kind of quality versus novelty aspect, so we our kind of quote unquote solution was just to try to measure both. So we have a quality measure with review recommendations, arguably, decent or, well, arguably great as a measure of quote unquote quality. A novelty presumably is an aspect, like a dimension of that, but we have a separate measure. And so let's deploy both measures.
I have a question, and it's a kind of a bigger picture question, because I remember when I was in my fourth or third year in my PhD, I went to a conference and I was talking to this emeritus professor, like this very old, eminent figure. And he said something that stuck with me. And he said that science advances one death at a time, right? And he said that at some point, someone gets so big within a subfield that his paradigm dominates over that subfield, and it's very difficult to go past that initial barrier of what he thinks is important, right? So I wanted to ask, do you think that's the case? Because one would think that for early day academics or early career academics like postdocs or PhD students or even assistant professors, we're kind of forced to play into this paradigm and play within the confinements of what our subfield dictates. But once you become once you have tenure, and Abel can tell us a bit more about this stuff, you feel more free to do whatever you want, right? You're no longer part of this game. So I think my question,
I get this rejected all the time.
Yeah, but now you get this rejected and you get to work on whatever you want. You know what I mean? So my question, I think, boils down to, do you think this is a feature or a bug of the system? Do you think the system was meant to be this way? or it just became like this when we are willingly or unwillingly hindering innovation?
Well, so a couple of thoughts. So from this project, I nothing there was conclusive, to be fair, right? And I came away with the what's called hypothesis, at least like my prior now, is that we have to distinguish between kind of early stage and late stage projects. That was basically my main takeaway. And there's a paper that came out about the same time or after, which was a model of the selection process. It was like a purely theory paper, but it just seemed, I don't know, it just kind of felt like very right. Thinking even more, I'm kind of like, now I can see some wrinkles. Again, maybe it's not 100% covered. But in general, like that paper was making, and this is actually forgetting reference now, but the paper was making this big distinction that when you are evaluating ideas before you have the evidence, novelty is kind of, you're going like, to be novel means going against the priors, right? It's essentially how they're defining novel, and that kind of seems appealing, I think. And if you're going against priors and you have no kind of mechanism by which to persuade, like you don't have the data, people have priors, you tell them they're wrong, or I'm going to do this project, I think you're wrong, I'm going to do this project, but you have no kind of mechanism to persuade, they reject your project because, well, you think I'm wrong, I think I'm right. So once the paper is done or the project's done, the paper is written, and you have the data in hand, suddenly you have a mechanism by which to persuade. And at this point, the only thing that can kind of prevent sort of the truth winning is some kind of bias or strategic concerns or something like kind of psychological kind of limitations. My sense, I guess at this point, let's just call it a hypothesis, is that those kind of behavioral kind of aspects in the latter stages are fairly minor once you have the data, the evidence in hand. Early on, yeah, I think it probably does matter quite a bit. And so going back to this question, like, does science advance one funeral at a time? I kind of don't buy that in that phrasing, at least. Like, given the project we're talking about, and, I wish we had many, many, many more, but at least once the evidence is in hand, I don't think we have evidence showing that things are very conservative. And also, in terms of like anecdotes, right? The baseline is things get rejected, right? As Abel said, but also you start thinking about positive anecdotes, and there's just so much demand for dismantling, overturning priors, right? Like you see all these papers that are like Nature, Science, whatever, that are like, people used to think this, but now like we provide evidence and it shows everybody was wrong. There's huge demand for these papers. We're all like dying to write, so to be able to, in a position to make those kinds of statements. So I think the demand is there. So I don't quite, this kind of, not to disagree with the hallowed fancy professor that, but not to disagree fully, I should say, but I think that kind of statement is a little too over generalized.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what people who are listening right now, this podcast, are thinking, because you started with a provocative title, and with like, everybody should think this was my prior, this seems obvious, and then actually now, well, the paper is published, here's the evidence, and maybe now people are fully convinced by the end of this conversation. It's going to be interesting to get a bit of feedback on this.
Right, yeah. And also, lastly, I think the tenure aspect, I mean, we're kind of, just laughing here, but I think the tenure is also kind of an interesting aspect of this whole thing. Certainly, I think the narrative around tenure is that it enables more risk-taking or taking positions that are unpopular or something, but I think there's a little bit of evidence on that, but not a ton. Again, prior, I guess, is it's not quite the case. Things don't radically change. I don't know. Again, maybe Abel, you have a different take. But
yeah, this I don't know. I mean, I know tons of people, there was zero change. Like literally, like it didn't matter. Their life like just, didn't change at all. Same research, same thing. For me, it was the complete opposite. The second I was going for tenure, and I sort of knew I would get it, but I knew I would get sabbatical. That's when I started the Institute for Replication. I was like, screw this, I'm tenured, now I can do it. Probably gonna piss off a lot of people. Don't care. And when I talked to, I remember there was I'm not going to say who it is, but we had this visitor from Brown University, and I remember asking him, like, he had tons of great projects published in top journals as an assistant professor, but they were all sort of not crazy novel. They were interesting, just adding
Incremental.
something. And then the second he got tenure, you could just see like he invented like sort of a new field within economics. You would talk to any sociologist, they would tell you we've been doing this forever. But as an economist, him working on these topics, I was like, this is so novel. This is so like out of the box. He's like, yeah, and I'm tenure. I don't care. And so there's some stories like this, but I think
Yeah,
for
yeah,
most people, I would say, like, I think if you run a basic like regression and you're just looking for the mean, I
yeah,
don't think you're going to find a big effect. But I think if you look at the outliers, I think
yeah, yeah.
tenure actually matters quite a lot. But I would imagine the effect is really non-linear, and you wouldn't pick it up with like a basic, like average treatment effect or something.
Give us a couple years, and when we have tenure, we'll tell you what we do with our careers.
Right, yeah, right.
Exactly.
We'll add a
No,
few
but
more data points, hopefully.
yeah, I think people like, I mean, some people are against tenure, some people love it. I think if you use it properly and you just start thinking about like how it changes the way you can actually do research and taking projects that are much more risky that might lead to nothing. You could spend like 3 years of your life working on something, and by the end of it you're just like, oops, I actually have zero output. I've completely like wasted my time. And I feel like as an assistant prof, there's no way you can do that. Like, especially if you're in a lab with many other people. But I feel like if you're tenure and you're starting a project, in theory, you can take like the amount of risk you can take is insane. It's completely out of like the ballpark. Like it's completely insane when you think about like what you can do with tenure. But anyway, like
Yeah,
yeah.
Misha, something that you said a bit ago, like stuck with me, and it was about the demand for these type of papers.
yeah.
Because where do you think this demand comes from? Because when you think about the publishing process, who do you think is demanding these papers? Do you think and you think about all the gates that a paper has to go through in order to be published? I could see the editors increasing the demand for these papers. You want to be the editor who published the paper, you want to be the editor who published the revolutionary study, whatever. But what about the peer reviewers, like the people who are getting this new paper and are quote unquote experts on this new field? How do you think they would feel about new paradigm coming into town? Like, I see the demand being out there, both for the public in general, who is interested in science advancing, and in the editor who is the one who wants to publish this thing. But do you think we're gatekeeping the access to people to publish these things just because of the publishing process?
So I think this is really interesting, and one sort of aspect of the system that I've been kind of thinking about more and more is how. So let's talk about publishing for now and how that works across different fields, right? So what I think is really striking, so you guys are economists, I'm a sociologist, we kind of used to a certain publishing ecosystem, whatever. But and in the big scheme of things, it's all kind of like small potatoes, right, relative to where the money and everything is, right, and the numbers, etc. And so what's striking about natural science, life science, what are publishing is a lot of the top outlets are being edited by full-time editors, right, who are not kind of active researchers. And so, whereas, in sociology, economics, that's kind of not the case, right? Generally, the editor is the colleague down the hall or whatever. And so first, I think in terms of maybe the biggest kind of distinction to make is between kind of full-time professional editors versus academic editors, right? Before we even get to the reviewers. My kind of loose hypothesis, I guess, is that the full-time editors at the Nature, Science, etc., are like fully like demand disconfirming kind of research a lot, and they do have their own kind of conflicts of interest and sort of like networks they're in, but it's not quite the same pressure as the person whose idea being displaced is like you're having lunch with them in an hour or whatever. So there's I think there more insulated from these kinds of pressures and can demand that very like actively, so that like my my kind of limited sense um, of experience of almost uniformly getting rejected at these places is like the first question like if it doesn't overturn some established knowledge, they're not interested, right?
Well, as a referee, also, you receive a very different list of questions. It's not
Mm,
your traditional like referee report that you would write. It's quite interesting actually to be a referee at PNAS, nature, science. It's a different experience.
different
It's
experience, yeah.
unpleasant. It's very unpleasant because you have to do it within like 6 days or whatever. And just like, guys, like this is crazy. But it's also interesting. So I relate a lot to your point. It's
Yeah, right. Like
fully agree.
so I think that's kind of something no one, I think, like someone should like that. To me feels like a first order question, like is the professional kind of insulation, let's say, of the editor matter? Like very possibly, yeah. So then with the reviewers, so one thing, for example, in our study, we found that, again, using this measure of novelty, if I remember correctly, we found no relationship between novelty and reviewers' recommendations in terms of how positive they are, but much higher likelihood of acceptance, and that being driven by the editors. And in our case, it was actually a mix.
The editors in your case are professional.
So we had kind of half and half. We had two
Well,
life
there you
science.
go.
Yeah, right. And I'm trying. Well, so one, I mean, problem I guess is that, yeah, you're right. I mean, in retrospect, which I probably
That's the
should have.
paper you should be writing right
I
now.
know, right? Like
There
I
you have
probably should have
another PNAS.
focused on that a lot more. But it was kind of, we had two journals from the life sciences, which were professional editors,
I
and a
see.
bunch from the physical sciences who were academics. So it's kind of like maybe two different of worlds. But in any case, reviewers, we saw no pattern. Editors highly selecting for novelty. So that I think would be consistent with this picture that, like, professionally, maybe there's too many. Some people like it, some don't. Maybe the mean effect is about zero, but the editors are like demanding this stuff. I think also, whom the editors kind of select as referees probably matters a lot for controversial or like claims that displace a clear idea. And I think the kind of conflicts of interests or kind of relationship, the kind of hidden, all these hidden connections, both within academia but also the professional editors, to me is like a big black box and an important question mark that we don't know much about.
Yeah, I
I
agree.
think this plays beautifully into one of other of your papers, the one on the spread of amplifying. The name of the paper is Amplifying the Impact of Open Access, Wikipedia, and the Diffusion of Science. I think this plays beautifully into this question on how is science spreading and how is the public consuming the new science. What can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so that paper was interested in Wikipedia as one channel through which science spreads. This was 2015, 16. Big debates were about, like, should we allow, Wikipedia in the classroom? Like, is it a legitimate reference? I mean, still, I guess, a little bit of a debate. Thought about, well, Wikipedia has this whole culture of, like, you have to document things. And so there's, like, some institutional kind of aspects to it, which would seem to, increase credibility. And it was also clear, with LLMs, now maybe this is less so, but like up until pretty recently, like that's where everyone went for like science content, in terms of the general public at least, but also like academics too, right?
For sure.
So it's like all of us are actually getting our like majority of our science not from some random article, but like a quick Wikipedia search. And so we just wanted to I'm like a little fuzzy on exactly what our kind of priors were going in, but basically what we wanted to see, clearly Wikipedia is referencing a lot of stuff. Clearly a lot of people are going to Wikipedia for science. Are there references of the nature that scientists would find most credible? And like the answer is basically yes, like very much so. Like the more cited or the more kind of high profile the paper, the more likely it was to be cited in Wikipedia. So from that, we kind of say that the kind of value system of scientists and Wikipedia editors seems to align. probably a good thing, though we didn't test it directly. And the kind of the more surprising maybe aspect, or that we really hadn't considered going in, is the importance of accessibility.
Hmm.
And that also, I think, is something that's going to change with time, with technology. But whether papers are accessible was like highly associated with them, and by accessible I mean like open access, was highly associated with them being referenced in Wikipedia, even kind of controlling for journal impact factor in our case.
And this is before LLMs. It's really like the people actually doing the entries in Wikipedia that need access actually to these articles.
That was our, yeah, it was kind of like, Wikipedia editors are also a bit of a black box as a popular. I mean, there's been plenty of studies on like specific cases, but as a whole, like we don't quite know what this entire population is. What kind of access do they have? Are these academics with their specialized access? Is it not? And kind of behaviorally, we could kind of conclude that, yeah, accessibility seems to matter quite a bit for these people.
I think these type of questions are now more relevant than ever, especially with what you mentioned, the upcoming of LLMs. Do you think people? I don't think that this is a secret, but people are changing the way they consume information, right? Rather than a quick Google search, we're now just asking ChatGPT or the new DeepSeek. Is it what it called? I think it is. And I think it's profoundly changing the way we consume information and research. Do you think this is still going to be the case with LLMs, like that people are consuming, quote unquote, and I don't want to say this, but I can't find the words, the right type of research? Like, are we guiding them to the newest and the most accepted version of what scientists say? Or just because the way LLM work, they are just spitting out whatever it's in the internet, and we're just building a gigantic misinformation machine?
But the open access is still really relevant here. I think you're still going to see that studies that are open access are going to be accessed by AI in general, and are going to be, I don't know, what do you think about that in general, the Juan Pablo's question?
Well, yeah, I mean, on the last point, that actually sounds like a fairly straightforward study that like somebody needs to do. Like, so I've seen, at least one study that was trying to see like basically what kind of references, in their case, I think ChatGPT generates for questions. If I remember correctly, they were finding that like the more highly cited the paper, the more likely it's to be generated. Accessibility is really interesting. I don't recall if anyone's really looked at that, but I'd be very curious what they find. I think, yeah, I don't have very kind of firsthand, let's say. I think these are, yeah, definitely big questions. I don't have firsthand evidence. So the one thing I think that's useful to point out is, the reference, like what are we comparing to, right? Like what's the kind of reference point? And I think people often kind of think of Google Scholar as like what we used to do in some way, and now maybe we're diversifying. And what I think is really fascinating about Google Scholar, which I'm like still waiting for like a study on somehow, is like there's this narrative of Google Scholar kind of concentrating attention or influence on the rich, and the rich get richer somehow. And then it's like these kind of metrics, and they're all being funneled into the same three people. And like Google Scholar is a big culprit. But in my kind of like anecdotal experience, like I think Google Scholar is like remarkably unconcentrated in terms of attention. And it's like the one force in academia preventing all attention concentrating on the same three people. Because like whenever you do Google Scholar search, right, it's, again, anecdotally, like it's always striking, like I haven't heard of these people or these journals. Why can't I sort by citations? Or I guess I can, but like why can't I choose the three journals I only care about? And it's like, I think if you ask people to reflect, they'll say, yeah, like Google Scholar is the only thing. There's always all the stuff I don't want to see on there. And it's like, I think it's like, it's actually the thing adding a lot of serendipity and kind of exposure to random stuff. And if left to our own devices, like if you ask any academics, like what feature do you want on, Google Scholar, they'll say like, I just want to, like, can I just like have a button for like Ivy League professors only or whatever, or like, sort by impact factor, like I only want management science or whatever. And that's like the annoying part is like we can't do that. And so in terms of LLMs, like, creating a world where attention or something's ultra concentrated, or I forget what the hypothesis, like I think actually the system we have now, because of Google Scholar, it's like surprisingly deconcentrated. What we're moving to next, I mean, who knows?
I think Abel said this in a previous episode, but I think my concern would be more attached to what people are now calling paper mills. And in a world where we have predatory journals and we have paper mills and we're just pouring research over and over again, it's going to become increasingly difficult to realize what's good research, what's peer-reviewed research. And now the benefits of serendipity of Google Scholar that you mentioned might be playing against us in a sense. Like if we have like LLMs just writing papers like there's no tomorrow, basically we can say whatever we want. And that plays a lot into misinformation, not only regular misinformation that we're used to, like sciencey misinformation, which somehow is even worse. So I don't know, like, look, I'm a great believer in technology, in LLMs, and I do think they are amazing. But talking to people who are experts on the field and have a sense of the gravity of the situation, gravity, quote unquote, I get a feeling that where science as a whole and the academics as a whole are not advancing at the same pace as technology is advancing. So it could be that at some point we're gonna be facing a problem that is much bigger than that any journal or that any editor or any university. We're just not prepared to deal with that sort of stuff. You know what I mean? Like I can see a world in which someone is interested in pushing, I don't know, some narrative about, let's say, climate change is not real, for example, quote. And you just have an army of papers publishing this stuff. And at the end of the day, you contaminate what the LLMs see, and it just becomes like a snowball effect where you just publish enough research saying that something is like this or like that, and at some point the LLMs just pick it up and they just start pushing this narrative to other people. You know what I mean? So
like smoking companies did this in the 40s, 50s, 60s, just publishing like tons of papers and. Yeah, but it didn't work. And now I'm wondering why it fell so badly. Or maybe it worked, actually. Maybe it did work. And maybe it took like decades for some people to actually stop smoking. I don't know.
Well, if you think about it, like there's places where people still believe smoking is not that bad, right? And we know that smoking causes cancer since, I don't know, the 50s, probably. So it's been 75 years of trying to inform the public, and still there are people who refuse to believe this stuff or are not exposed to the proper information. So I don't know. I can see someone saying that their misinformation campaigns were super effective. Like where tobacco companies are still able to sell basically unrestricted today in most of the world. You know what I mean? Unrestricted, quote unquote. Like they have a lot of advertisement restrictions, but you can still go into a convenience store and buy a pack of cigarettes, you know?
Probably with a very offensive like sticker on them though.
For sure.
But yeah. So there's that's kind of like the biggest question of like all of science or something, right? Like how do we draw the boundary between like what's true and what's not? So, some like to take some bits of that kind of big topic. So first, there's this narrative that like outputs just keep, increasing exponentially and LLMs will just supercharge that. So we are hopefully going to have a draft soon on this. Like, turns out that's like already not the case. So if you actually track the latest data, worldwide output of science is actually like decreasing. Like it's kind of shocking, right? No one actually. This is like very fresh. It's like depends on how you measure and what exactly outputs you're tracking, yada yada. But like basically the exponential, kind of curve we're all kind of the stylized fact we're all used to is actually not the case anymore.
So when did it peak? Like 2020, even before?
It was like 2022, I believe. It depends on which database you use. I forget all the details. So, we are like working on this as we speak. So first of all, like this kind of now LLMs are fairly recent. Okay, maybe that's going to change tomorrow. I don't know. But in general, like lots of efforts around the world are trying to cut down on predatory publishing, and those seem to be working. Like we can see the numbers of these special issues, et cetera, dropping. Like that's just so there's already kind of a pushback that seems to be pretty effective, large scale. So that's one aspect. And then I think I'm both like a pessimist and an optimist on this front. So pessimist in the sense that like we've been in a situation maybe forever where you could find references to support your point if you don't care about their credibility, right? Smoking, one example, right? But like, let's say you want to write a paper tomorrow and you're like, well, as everybody knows, science is very conservative because reviewers hate novel work and blah, blah. Like you can have like 20 references, immediately supporting your point. If you wanted to say the opposite, you could say, well, actually, like, recent evidence shows, and you wanted to like cite my paper, which you should, you have that option, right? So it's kind of like we're already in a world for most topics at the research frontier where you have the freedom to cite, like you have resources available for citing any point you want to prove, right? So we're really relying on not.
I would
It's
say in the social sciences, I agree with you. I don't think we're at that point for like drugs or physics, or maybe I'm wrong, huh? In the social sciences, I see your point that
yeah,
it depends on your values. It depends, like, it's not hard science, so you can already find paper, like people disagreeing on pretty much everything. But you would
yeah. I
imagine,
mean,
I don't know.
yeah. I hope, suspect that's not the case in like, pure math or whatever, but like epidemiology, life sciences, right? A lot of the stuff is empirical. A lot of it is like, not that different from the same challenges we have in social sciences. And it's like clinical trials also have all these biases in them and problems. So it's kind of like, like smoking, it's kind of like a life science issue. And yet, yeah, of course you can find, and so we have already been relying not on the supply of, like the supply is not, we've already had supply of good and bad papers kind of forever, right? So we've always been relying on the evaluator to draw a line somewhere. And so if the bottom tail of science has even more bad stuff in it, I guess the optimist part of me is like, well, who cares? Like we weren't citing that stuff to begin with, and we're still not going to. Will editors be and kind of journals be overwhelmed by this deluge of stuff where their like ability to assess breaks down? I don't know, conceivably, but like there's mechanisms you could institute, right? Like they may be really unfair, but you could be like, if you have not published here before, you can't submit a paper, right? They're like
With just
maybe it
money,
would, or
you
just
know,
money, right? I mean,
there's a
maybe it's
fee
not
of
even.
$1 for submitting a manuscript. You just scale like,
Yeah,
yeah,
maybe it doesn't even cost much. I don't know, right? Like for example, like I was looking at like Journal of Financial Economics or something takes like 700, like to submit a paper costs
yeah,
like
that's crazy.
$750, right? So it's like, are they going to be overwhelmed with LM papers? Like probably not. I don't know.
If they are, good for them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, then that's going to be the real moneymaker. So anyway, I think I'm fairly optimistic that there's mechanisms to keep doing the same evaluation work we have been doing. And maybe that means disregarding a lot of stuff. Well, we've been doing that anyway. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm fairly optimistic on that front.
That's super interesting. I think we'll have to have you in another episode just telling us when you have results with this paper and telling us all about
Oh
it,
yeah, yeah.
because it's just super interesting.
Let's meet again in 10 years because that's how long these papers seem to take.
Yeah, exactly.
10 years just to get it done and another 10 just to get it published.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Misha, it has been amazing having you here. Do you have any last remarks before we go?
No, really fun conversation. I think these are super important topics. So I'm really glad you guys are doing this podcast, and I hope you keep at it. It's
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks.
I can speak for myself, but we usually have a blast. It's been great having you.
Yeah, and my pleasure. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. See you in another episode.
All right, gentlemen.